In this video, we're going to look at deploying a model in SageMaker with a lot more detail. To follow along, open up the Boston Housing XGBoost Deploy Low-Level Notebook. Again, the majority of this notebook is the same as the low-level notebook that we went through that used the batch transform method for testing the resulting model. To remind ourselves of how this works, first we load up any of the necessary modules. Then we download and prepare the data, but in this case, since we're using data provided by sklearn, it's very simple. We split the data up into a training, validation, and testing set. Then we save the data locally and upload it to S3. Once our training data is available on S3, we can set up the training job, where we describe all of the important bits, like, for example, what algorithm we want to use, the hyperparameters specific to that algorithm, and where our data is stored. Once we have described the training job, we then ask SageMaker to create and run that training job, and we can wait for that job to complete. Once the training job terminates, the output of the machine learning algorithm, in this case XGBoost, is saved to S3, and those resulting files are called the model artifacts. We can then create a model inside of SageMaker by specifying which model artifacts should be used, along with which Docker container contains the appropriate inference code. Just like in the previous video, instead of testing the model using the batch transform functionality, we're going to deploy the model and then send the test data to the deployed endpoint. Remember, in SageMaker, deploying a model means creating an endpoint. And that endpoint, from the user's perspective, is just a URL that we can send data to. Behind the scenes, things are a little more complicated, but fortunately, SageMaker takes care of most of the heavy lifting. What this means for us is that to deploy a model means to create an endpoint, and to create an endpoint, we need to tell SageMaker some details about how that endpoint should operate. In other words, we need to create an endpoint configuration. Just like most of the objects that we deal with inside of SageMaker, an endpoint must have a name, and that name must be unique. So we're going to use the same trick that we've used before by appending a timestamp to the end of our chosen name. Once we have a name, we need to specify a list of what are called production variants. In effect, these are different versions of the same model or different models. An endpoint sort of acts like a uniform resource that we can send data to. SageMaker can then take the data that is sent to an endpoint and, if we want it to, split it up among different models. For now, we only want to deploy a single model at our endpoint. And so our production variants consist of a single item, and that single item is the model that we specified, that we created earlier. Once we ask SageMaker to create the endpoint configuration, a new object has been created. Now, this endpoint configuration can be thought of as a blueprint that we can use as many times as we need to in the future, and it tells SageMaker how to create a specific endpoint. So, for example, if I go back to the SageMaker console, and on the left-hand side here, I look at endpoint configurations, you can see this first one here is the endpoint configuration that we just created. So this will stay here in perpetuity, and we can create an endpoint using this blueprint, this configuration, whenever we'd like to. Heading back to the notebook, we can now ask SageMaker to create an endpoint based on the configuration we just made. Again, just like always, we have to make sure to specify a name, and that name must be unique. So now SageMaker is setting up our endpoint in the background, and as before, we can use this method here to see a visual output as to how our endpoint construction is progressing. While SageMaker works on setting up our endpoint, let's take a look and see what was created. If we head back to the SageMaker console, remember that this object here is the endpoint configuration that we made, and if we further click on the endpoints listing here on the left, we can see the endpoint that we just asked SageMaker to create. And currently, it is in the process of being created. So we'll wait for SageMaker to finish making this endpoint for us. Now we can see that our endpoint is in service. If we head back to the notebook, we can see that the process of creating our endpoint has been completed as well. So now we can test the model, which, as we said before, means we can serialize our data and then send it to an endpoint. Now, in this case, because we don't have a predictor object, we need to serialize the data ourselves, which is pretty straightforward. We basically just turn our matrix, which is a listing of records, into a comma delimited file. So we do that. Then we use the SageMaker runtime client to call our endpoint with the specified name, with content which is a CSV file, and then we include the data we wish to have our model process. The resulting object is then a serialized output, which we need to convert to a string and then turn back into a NumPy array. Once we have our resulting output, we can then plot a nice little graph. As before, once we're done using our endpoint, we need to shut it down. But I'm going to show you a slightly different way to shut down the endpoint from just using the notebook methods. So if we go back to the SageMaker console and look at our endpoint, clicking on this endpoint here gives us some more information about it. In particular, right here is the actual URL that can be used to send data to our endpoint. Now, it turns out not just anyone can send data here, and we'll talk about that more in detail later on. Another useful feature of this page is this delete button. If I click on the delete button, it will shut down the endpoint for us. So we don't have to use the notebook to shut down the endpoints. We can use the SageMaker console as well. And yes, we'd like to delete it.